Hello, my name is Nicole Zinn, and I'm a team leader in EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs Pesticide Reevaluation Division. I'll be moderating today's webinar. Today we have 3 speakers from the EPA joining us to provide an overview of the ecological mitigation measures described on the mitigation menu website and to demonstrate the tools that are available. These speakers are Libby Karn, Stephen Muella, and Frank Ferrugia. Libby is a biologist in the Biological and Economic Analysis Division in the EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs. Stephen is a scientist, and Frank is a senior science advisor in the Environmental State and Effects Division in the same office. Next slide. Before we begin, here are a few tips for viewing our webinar. To toggle between a maximized and standard view of the presentation, click on the 4-corner symbol highlighted by the yellow arrow. If you are having technical difficulties, please raise the hand icon highlighted with the blue arrow, and we will do our best to help. If you are having technical difficulties, to download the PDF of the presentation, press the paper icon highlighted in green. And to pose a question, use the question box shown with the red arrow. Please note that all participants' mics will be muted during this event.
Hi everyone, my name is Libby, and today I'm going to talk to you about mitigation measures for reducing pesticide runoff and erosion and mitigation measures for pesticide spray drift. These are part of EPA's new strategies to reduce pesticide exposure to non-target species, including species listed under the Endangered Species Act, or ESA. I'm going to start with an overview of the strategies and the mitigation menu. Then I'll go over runoff and erosion mitigation, and finally spray drift mitigation. For both runoff and erosion and for spray drift, I'll explain how a pesticide user determines what mitigation is needed and where for their intended application. Then I'll go through descriptions of some of the mitigation measures, focusing on some recent updates. First, I'll start with a brief overview of the regulatory framework of the strategies. The Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, is a federal law that regulates the distribution, sale, and use of pesticides. Under FIFRA, EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs is responsible for carrying out certain actions, including registration and registration review decisions for pesticides through which EPA authorizes the sale, distribution, and use of pesticides according to the product labeling. When EPA takes an action on a pesticide registration, the agency has a responsibility under the ESA to ensure that pesticide registrations do not jeopardize the continued existence of federally threatened or endangered or listed species, or adversely modify their designated critical habitats. EPA must consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, collectively known as the services, on actions that may affect a listed species to ensure listed species populations will not be jeopardized or critical habitat negatively affected. During consultation, the services provide EPA with measures where needed to avoid jeopardy to listed species and adverse modification of critical habitats from a pesticide. This slide is an overview of EPA's pesticide registration review process for existing pesticides, including the ESA consultation process. EPA plans to include runoff and spray drift mitigation from the strategies into proposed interim and proposed final decisions under FIFRA as necessary. The process of consultation with the services, for most cases, will occur during the interim decision or following the interim decision and before the final decision steps of the registration review process. But this could also occur at other steps. The services are not always on the same schedule, so the consultation process and comment periods for each could be at different points in the process. To reach a final decision, EPA must complete consultation with both services. Pesticide users will need to look for updated label directions on pesticide products and ensure that label mitigation is in place for the application. To reduce the burden on pesticide users, EPA strives to focus mitigation where it is necessary to protect species. Okay. EPA has released final strategies for herbicides, insecticides, and rodenticides. EPA has a Vulnerable Species Action Plan, or VSAP, that covers 27 listed species that are particularly vulnerable to pesticide exposure. EPA has future plans for a fungicide strategy, and Hawaii will have its own strategy because Hawaii has more than a third of the US's listed species and also has some unique pesticide use patterns. Most of the strategies cover only agricultural pesticide areas, although VSAP and the Hawaii strategy also cover some non-agricultural use sites. I should also mention here that the strategies only cover conventional pesticides, so biopesticides and antimicrobials are not included. Given the formidable task of meeting EPA's obligations as part of the registration processes conducted under FIFRA, the agency committed to developing strategies for identifying early mitigation measures to reduce population-level impacts of pesticides to listed species. This means reducing pesticide exposure to species listed as threatened or endangered, critical habitats associated with these species, and any species that a listed species depends upon for survival, such as for food, shelter, or for pollination. The strategies consider potential exposure to listed species that occur on the field where pesticides are applied, and also exposure through runoff, erosion, and pesticide spray drift. EPA will use these strategies as they consider registrations and registration review cases. The strategies are designed to provide EPA reviewers a set of mitigation for broad classes of pesticides that will be protective of large groups of listed species. Having a consistent set of mitigation measures is expected to be less complex and less impactful for users than creating unique mitigation for each listed species and for each individual chemical. The strategies will also streamline the process for consultation with the services to ensure that pesticide labels are compliant with the Endangered Species Act. In some cases, additional mitigation may be needed under the ESA for specific species. EPA's new strategies are not self-implementing and are not implemented immediately for all pesticides after a strategy is released. Rather, implementation of the strategies will be a gradual process, with strategies applied to pesticide products when new active ingredients or certain new uses of existing products are registered, or when an existing active ingredient goes through the registration review process. Over time, the strategies are expected to be considered on a rolling basis for all applicable pesticide products. EPA has entered into a memorandum of understanding with the Fish and Wildlife Service that mitigation implemented through the strategies will be used to streamline the process for consultation between EPA and FWS. As part of the strategies, EPA has developed a mitigation menu with options for runoff and erosion mitigation and options for spray drift buffer mitigation. This is a new system of mitigation intended to offer pesticide users flexibility to choose mitigation measures that work for their crop, their region, their agronomic practices, and for the individual field. The mitigation menu has about 36 mitigation measures for runoff and erosion and about 20 for spray drift that pesticide users can select from to meet their label mitigation requirements. The mitigation menu can be found at EPA's mitigation menu website, which is listed on the slide. You'll note that the website URL here is underlined in blue. If you download a copy of the slides by clicking the paper icon at the right of your webinar window, the hyperlinks in those slides will take you to the relevant website. Flexibility in mitigation is something that EPA stakeholders have been asking for because it will have significantly lower impacts to pesticide users than a single set of fixed mitigation that all users must follow. EPA does recognize that this type of mitigation system is new and it will have a learning curve for pesticide users. That is why EPA has created a series of webinars like this one and prepared education and outreach materials directed to pesticide users and other stakeholders. EPA's education and outreach materials are available on the Pesticide and Endangered Species Educational Resources Toolbox website, linked on this slide. The Resources Toolbox website has recordings of the previous webinars on the herbicide strategy, insecticide strategy, the runoff and erosion mitigation menu, and lots of other resources related to the strategies. And EPA has developed a web-based app called the Pesticide App for Label Mitigation, or PALM, to assist pesticide users in using the mitigation menu. EPA intends the mitigation menu to be a living document. EPA has worked with stakeholders and incorporated feedback from public comments to update the mitigation menu as more information has become available. EPA is continuing to work with stakeholders and intends to make more updates in the future. These potential updates include new mitigation measures, expansions of existing mitigation measures, and updated language to clarify descriptions that stakeholders have indicated to us are unclear. When the mitigation menu is updated, any new language supersedes the old language and will apply to all mitigation for the strategies. So the updates that were released in April 2025 with the final insecticide strategy also apply to the herbicide strategy that was finalized in 2024. In this section of the webinar, I'm going to talk about the runoff and erosion mitigation menu and mitigation measures. We'll cover spray drift later in this webinar. When EPA implements the strategies for a pesticide, the ecological risk assessment will indicate the potential for population level impacts to listed species from pesticide runoff or erosion. The potential for population level impacts will be classified as not likely, low, medium, or high, and this sets the level of runoff or erosion mitigation needed to protect listed species. For runoff-prone chemicals, pesticide labels will list a 0, 3, 6, or 9-point requirement from the mitigation menu. For erosion-prone chemicals, pesticide labels will list 0, 2, 4, or 6 mitigation points. Some product labels will also have geographically specific mitigation for listed species habitats in areas where those species occur. These are called pesticide use limitation areas, or PULAs. PULAs allow EPA to set higher levels of mitigation in areas where it is needed, while not over-mitigating where it is not needed. EPA's Bulletins Live 2, or BLT, website contains these geographically specific bulletins with PULA mitigation. EPA presented a webinar on BLT and how to use the BLT website in November 2023, and you can find a link to a recording of that webinar on EPA's Strategies Toolbox website. EPA has been making changes to the BLT website since that webinar. One of these is that applicators can check if their intended application area is in a PULA and see which products may have bulletins. Some fields could have 0, 1, or multiple PULAs depending on which products are used. Now I'll go over how a pesticide user knows what runoff or erosion mitigation is needed. Pesticide users will need to check the pesticide product label to see the required number of mitigation points for their crop or use site. The product label may also direct them to check the BLT website. If the label has directions to check BLT, the pesticide user needs to check the website no more than 6 months before they apply. For applicators who apply pesticides throughout the year, they may need to check the website every 6 months so that they've always checked no more than 6 months before any given application. If the intended application area is in a PULA with a bulletin for that use site, they will need to follow the bulletin directions. If there are different point requirements on the label and BLT, use the higher point requirement. If your product label does not list a required number of points for your use site and it doesn't direct you to the BLT website, then you don't need any mitigation from the runoff and erosion mitigation menu, and you can skip all of the rest of the steps on this slide. As the strategies are implemented for more pesticides over time through the normal regulatory process, strategies mitigation will become pretty common on product labels. Once a pesticide user knows whether there is a mitigation point requirement for their crop and their area, they should examine the specific field and see whether runoff or erosion mitigation measures will be needed for that specific application. Assessments will need to be conducted on a field-by-field basis. Depending on the application method, field drainage, and what areas are downslope of the field, some applications will not need mitigation from the mitigation menu. Users can find the full list of these application methods and areas on the mitigation menu website. If the intended pesticide application on the specific field doesn't need runoff or erosion mitigation, they can skip the next step. Now that the pesticide user knows how many points are needed and where for their intended pesticide application, they can start selecting mitigation measures from the mitigation menu. First, apply points for mitigation relief and any mitigation measures that are already in place on the field. If the field already achieves enough points to meet the point requirement, then the pesticide user doesn't need to add any additional runoff or erosion mitigation measures. However, if more points are needed, the pesticide user will have to implement additional mitigation measures until the required number of points has been met. Once they've met the requirement, they may apply the pesticide. If a pesticide user is going to use multiple pesticide products in the same field, they will need to meet the point requirement for each individual product being used. Pesticide users are encouraged to plan ahead for the products they intend to use for the entire growing season. In many cases, if a pesticide user makes a plan for the pesticide with the highest point requirement, this plan will also achieve enough points for pesticides with lower point requirements. Runoff or erosion mitigation is needed to protect areas where runoff or erosion could result in population level effects to non-target species. This means runoff or erosion mitigation from the mitigation menu is not needed in areas where population level effects are not likely. For purposes of the mitigation menu, no runoff or erosion mitigation is needed if the entire area 1,000 feet down gradient from the pesticide treatment area consists of managed areas. 1,000 feet down gradient means the area 1,000 feet from the edge of the treated area on the downslope side. Runoff or erosion mitigation is not needed on the upslope side of the application area because runoff only flows downhill. The descriptions of what EPA considers to be managed areas for runoff and erosion have had a recent update, which was released with the final insecticide strategy and the updated version of the mitigation menu website in 2025. EPA updated this description based on public comment and in collaborations with federal and state agencies to add some types of managed areas and to clarify language for some other types of managed areas. This updated language supersedes the old language and applies to all of the strategies. You can find this updated language on the mitigation menu website and in EPA's mitigation support document. EPA intends to continue improving on this language in the future based on feedback from stakeholders. There are several types of areas that can qualify as a managed area. Agricultural fields, pastures, forage fields, and privately owned rangeland are managed areas. This includes untreated portions of the field if a pesticide is only applied to part of the field. Roads, paved and gravel surfaces, grassy, fallow, or bare ground areas directly next to the field also count. Buildings and their perimeters and other man-made structures that have walls and/or a roof can also be included. Areas that are maintained as a mitigation measure for either runoff and erosion or for spray drift mitigation are considered managed areas. Managed areas also include any land enrolled in USDA's Conservation Reserve Program or Agricultural Conservation Easement Program land, although pesticide users may need to ensure that pesticide movement into those areas does not degrade habitat as part of their participation in those programs. On-farm water sources can count as managed areas as long as they do not connect to adjacent water bodies. Areas that do not qualify as managed areas are wildlife habitats, conservation areas, or land that is not being actively or passively managed. In the rest of the presentation, I'll refer to these as non-managed areas. Now we'll go into an example of where runoff and erosion mitigation is required for a group of agricultural fields. In this example, we'll consider 6 fields labeled A through F. These fields are mostly surrounded by other fields, which count as managed areas. The roads and the strips of bare ground between fields and roads are also managed areas. The creek, represented by it with a blue line, is a non-managed area. The wooded and grassy areas near the creek could be non-managed areas, but they could also count as a managed area if they are being actively managed as a riparian zone. The state wildlife management area at the top of the image is a non-managed area because this is a conservation site with habitat for non-target species. Now I've added a 1,000-foot zone around the edge of each field, marked with the slope of the field with an arrow pointing towards the downslope side. Remember, mitigation is not needed if the area 1,000 feet down gradient of a treated area consists entirely of managed areas. If we look at field F, the entire yellow shaded area surrounding the field is managed area, which means runoff or erosion mitigation is not needed for this field. Field A borders a non-managed area, but the wildlife management area is upslope of the field, not downslope. So field A also does not require runoff or erosion mitigation. Fields B, C, D, and E all have at least some part of the area 1,000 feet downslope from the field that is a non-managed area. So a pesticide application on these fields would need runoff or erosion mitigation from the mitigation menu. I'll note here that if a pesticide user is using a field-adjacent mitigation measure, like a vegetative filter strip, these would only be needed on the downslope edge of the field, not around the entire perimeter of the field. Later on in this presentation, we'll consider which fields in this scenario may need pesticide spray drift mitigation. But for now, we're going to shift gears to talk about mitigation measures for fields where runoff or erosion mitigation is needed. I'm not going to go into detail about every mitigation measure because there are a lot of mitigation measure options and we have limited time here today. But I'll highlight mitigation measures that EPA revised when the insecticide strategy was released in April 2025, and some mitigation measures that stakeholders have requested additional clarification on. I'll start with sandy soils. Sandy soils allow water to infiltrate effectively into the soil so that it is less prone to runoff from an application area. This is a mitigation measure which has been updated based on public comments and collaboration with stakeholder groups. Loam, and silt soils without a restrictive layer that impedes the movement of water, which generally align with hydrologic soil group B soils, receive 2 mitigation points. Sand, loamy sand, or sandy loam soils without a restrictive layer, or hydrologic soil group A soils, receive 3 mitigation points. To look up the soil type of an application area, pesticide users can use the USDA Web Soil Survey online tool, which can be found at the website listed on the slide. If a pesticide user has had soil type testing and mapping done for a field that shows that the field has predominantly sandy soils, they can also use that. There are 3 categories of mitigation measures that can be applied on fields, adjacent to fields, and some systems that can capture runoff. Fields can receive 1 point if they have mitigation measures from at least 2 of these 3 categories. This point is awarded because runoff reduction is more effective when pesticide users combine mitigation that reduces runoff at multiple points in the pesticide runoff pathway. In-field mitigation measures prevent runoff before it occurs. Field-adjacent mitigation measures reduce runoff as it leaves an application area. And systems that capture runoff and discharge capture pesticide residues after runoff from a field has already occurred. A table of which mitigation measures fit into each of these 3 categories can be found on the mitigation menu website. If you are using EPA's new POEM tool or the Runoff and Erosion Mitigation Calculator tool, this point is automatically calculated for you. The irrigation water management mitigation measure hasn't changed, but I'm highlighting it here to include some clarifications. Some methods of irrigation are more prone to reproducing tailwater runoff than others, but well-controlled irrigation can have relatively little potential for irrigation-induced runoff. General irrigation water management is irrigation with the use of runoff-reducing technology to apply the appropriate volume and timing of irrigation water. This can be done using drip tape, drip emitters, or microsprinklers that apply a reduced volume of water targeted to the crop. For center pivot or sprinkler systems, water measure control devices or soil moisture sensors must be used to schedule irrigation when it is needed and to apply the correct volume of water. Or for furrow irrigation, systems must use water control devices with computerized hole selection and surge valves to apply water evenly across the field. These types of irrigation are all worth 2 points. Irrigation that is delivered subsurface or under impermeable plastic has low potential for surface water runoff, so this type of irrigation receives 3 points. And finally, non-irrigated fields don't have any potential for irrigation-induced runoff, so rain-fed and dryland farming systems all receive 3 points. Anionic polyacrylamide, or PAM, is used as a soil conditioner in some agricultural and urban settings to reduce soil erosion. This is a new mitigation measure added this year. PAM stabilizes soil particles and would reduce pesticide movement through sediment erosion and liquid runoff. This mitigation measure is worth 2 points. To qualify, water-soluble formulations of anionic PAM must be used. This is because of toxicity concerns associated with oil-based formulations of anionic PAM. Growers or applicators can work with technical specialists to develop mitigation plans for individual fields. Because growers or applicators would be working with experts to develop a site-specific plan based on the needs of individual fields, EPA considers that runoff and erosion mitigation measures on these fields is likely to be higher than average efficacy in reducing runoff or erosion of pesticides. There are many types of specialists working in different regions of the country, either individually or as part of a business or a government-run organization. But in general, a specialist must have 3 things. 1, have technical training, education, and/or experience in an agricultural discipline, water or soil conservation, or other relevant discipline that provides training and practice in the area of runoff or erosion mitigation technologies or measures. 2, participation in continued education or training in the area of expertise, which should include runoff and erosion control. And 3, have experience advising on conservation measures designed to develop site-specific runoff and erosion plans that include EPA's runoff and erosion mitigation measures. Fields where the grower is working with a runoff and erosion specialist and has implemented their recommended mitigation measures on the field receive 1 point. Participating in a conservation program is one of the mitigation measures that has had a significant change with the release of the final insecticide strategy in April 2025, and is an area where EPA is continuing to work with stakeholders. Conservation programs provide technical assistance to growers and applicators, similar to specialists on the previous slide, but programs also offer additional support, such as review of design and installation, and upkeep or maintenance plans for mitigation measures. Many conservation programs are not explicitly designed to reduce pesticide transport, but many of the conservation measures that they require for soil conservation or for nutrient management will also function to reduce runoff and erosion of pesticides. In the final herbicide strategy and the draft insecticide strategies released in 2024, EPA awarded 2 points for conservation programs that meet the list of characteristics listed on EPA's mitigation menu website. EPA received numerous public comments on those strategies. Based on those comments and feedback from stakeholders, EPA has reassessed this mitigation measure. EPA has decided to create a list of qualified conservation programs where farms that have implemented the program's requirements would qualify for the maximum number of points required under the strategies, or 9 points. EPA plans to work with federal, state, and local stakeholders to identify programs that may qualify for this list, and is developing a process for evaluating these programs. This will involve an information collection request, so that programs that are interested in being on the list of qualified programs can submit their information to EPA so that they can be qualified. This process will also involve public comment periods, so there will be opportunity for more stakeholder feedback. For now, there is one conservation program that has been determined to be a qualifying conservation program. This is the USDA Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, when incorporating the Integrated Pest Management Conservation Practice Standard. EPA intends to create a web page that will house the list of qualified conservation programs once more programs have been qualified. In the meantime, fields that are part of farms enrolled in a conservation program that meets the characteristics listed on the mitigation menu website will continue to receive 2 points. Fields can receive 1 point if pesticide users adopt mitigation tracking. This is keeping a record of which mitigation measures or relief points are in place on a field for each pesticide applied. EPA has developed tools to assist pesticide users in planning and tracking mitigation points. EPA has a web-based tool called the Pesticide App for Label Mitigation, or PALM, a PDF worksheet that users can print and take out into the field with them to fill out, or an Excel-based calculator tool that calculates points for the mitigation measures. We'll be showing a demo of these tools later on in this webinar. The tools are designed to contain all of the information that users need to track mitigation measures and points for a field. Pesticide users can also use their own methods to track mitigation if they prefer. Reducing application rates reduces the mass of pesticide that is available to run off from fields. Annual application rates can be reduced either by reducing the single application rate or by reducing the number of applications in a growing season for pesticides that allow multiple applications. Application rate reductions can receive 1 to 3 points depending on the percent reduction compared to the maximum annual application rate listed on the label. As an example, if a pesticide label has an annual maximum application rate of 12 ounces per acre, and an applicator makes 2 applications of 4 ounces per acre, this totals an annual rate of 8 ounces. 8 ounces per acre is a 33% reduction compared to the maximum of 12 ounces per acre, so it qualifies for 2 points. In deciding whether an application rate reduction is appropriate for a pesticide, there are a few factors to consider. Pesticide users should not use an application rate lower than a maximum rate listed on a label, and the user should consider resistance management and not apply less than the rate they expect is needed to achieve effective control of target pests. Using rates that are too low to be effective can select for pest individuals that are resistant to that pesticide and can contribute to resistance development in the future. Remember, this is only a sample of the available mitigation measures. We encourage users to visit the mitigation website and view the full suite of available options. Also, remember that the new mitigation measures will be periodically added to the website, so be sure to check back as new options become available. Now we'll shift gears from the runoff and erosion mitigation measures to talk about mitigation for spray drift. Spray drift buffer mitigation for the strategies was recently added to EPA's mitigation menu website. When strategies are implemented for pesticides, the ecological risk assessment will indicate the potential for population-level impacts to listed species from exposure to pesticide spray drift. The potential for spray drift varies by application method, and so the required spray drift buffer size also varies. Maximum spray drift buffer sizes were updated in April 2025, so some of the ecological spray drift buffer distances in this table are lower than in previous versions of the strategies. These will apply for all of the strategies, not just the insecticide strategy. Spray drift buffer sizes in this table assume that no other spray drift mitigation is in place and are a starting point before any spray drift mitigation measures are applied. If population level impacts to listed species are not likely for a pesticide use, then no downwind ecological spray drift buffer is needed. If the potential for population level impacts is low, then the minimum spray drift buffer sizes for the strategies will be applied. This is a 50-foot buffer for aerial applications, a 10-foot buffer for ground spray, or a 25-foot buffer for air blast. If the potential for population level impacts is high for a particular pesticide use, then the maximum spray drift buffer size will be applied. This is a 300-foot buffer for aerial applications, a 100-foot buffer for ground spray, or an 85-foot buffer for air blast. If the potential for population level impacts is medium, then a specific spray drift buffer size is calculated for that pesticide, and this distance will be somewhere between the minimum and maximum buffer sizes. For all pesticide products, any required spray drift buffers will be listed on the pesticide label and on the BLT website if applicable. Now I'll go over how a pesticide user would know what spray drift buffer is needed for the product they are planning to apply. For each product, the user will check the product label, and if the label directs them to check Bulletins Live 2, they will also have to visit the BLT website no more than 6 months before the application to check if the application area is in a PULA with a bulletin for their crop or use site. They will also need to follow the directions in that bulletin if it is available. If there are different drift buffer sizes listed on the label and BLT, use the larger buffer size. If the user is planning to use multiple products together in a tank mix, they should check all products' labels and use the largest spray drift buffer size. Next, determine whether spray drift mitigation is needed for that specific field. Spray drift buffers are not needed for some fields, depending on the application type and what areas are downwind of the field. And pesticide users can find the complete list of these application types and areas on the mitigation menu website. If a spray drift buffer is needed, the pesticide user can select from a variety of spray drift mitigation measures to reduce the size of that buffer. Users can follow the instructions on the mitigation menu website for calculating buffer sizes, or they can use EPA's POEM tool or other calculator tools. Using spray drift mitigation measures, ecological spray drift buffers can be reduced or eliminated entirely. I'll note here that this is just for ecological spray drift buffers that are required as part of the strategies. Spray drift buffers may also be needed to protect human health or for other reasons. If there are additional spray drift restrictions on a pesticide label or bulletin, or if state or local government has a requirement that prohibits or restricts spray drift from an application area, that restriction must still be followed. If a downwind spray drift buffer is required for a pesticide application, it is only required on the downwind edge or edges of the application area. EPA is not requiring omnidirectional spray drift buffers under the strategies. Spray drift buffers must be immediately downwind of the application area and can consist of untreated portions of the field, but EPA is not requiring that any buffers must be within the field for the strategies. Spray drift mitigation measures adjacent to the field can be counted in the buffer distance and could make up the entire spray drift buffer so that no infield buffer is needed for that application. Downwind spray drift buffers may need to be in a different location on different days, depending on the direction of the wind. Managed areas can also be counted as a spray drift buffer. The definition of a managed area is the same for spray drift as it was for runoff and erosion mitigation, but how these are applied is a little different. For runoff and erosion, the entire area down gradient from the application must be managed areas in order to eliminate the need for runoff and erosion mitigation. In contrast, for spray drift, managed areas downwind of the application are subtracted from the spray drift buffer distance. This means that spray drift buffers can be either partially reduced or completely eliminated after accounting for downwind managed areas. Now let's revisit the field example I showed earlier in the runoff and erosion section of this webinar. This is the same group of fields labeled A through F. All of the fields, the roads, and the strips of bare ground between fields and roads are managed areas. The creek and the state wildlife management area are non-managed areas. The wooded and grassy areas near the creek might be non-managed areas, but they could count as managed if they are being actively managed as a riparian area. For this example, we'll consider a pesticide user planning to apply a pesticide that EPA has determined to have a high potential for population level impacts. And so the pesticide label lists the maximum spray drift buffer size used in the strategies. The pesticide user could apply this pesticide by ground boom or by aerial application, so we'll consider buffers for each. The light pink buffer zone is 100 feet wide, the maximum buffer distance for ground applications. The dark pink buffer zone is 300 feet wide, the maximum buffer distance for aerial applications. The arrow in the upper left corner shows the direction that the wind is blowing on this day. So the downwind side of the field is on the southeast edge or edges of the field. Fields A, D, and F have only managed areas within the drift buffer zones on the southeast edge of the field, so no ecological spray drift buffer is needed there. Field B borders the creek to the east, and so a spray drift buffer is needed on the east edge of the field for either ground or aerial applications. Field C also borders the creek on its downwind side, so a spray drift buffer is needed on the south edge of the field for either ground or aerial applications. Field E has one corner that is close to the creek and is 250 feet away. The distances here are a bit hard to see on this landscape map view, So I'll show a close-up of this field on the next slide. Here we can see field E with the maximum downwind spray drift buffer sizes. And I've removed the buffer zones for field C and D to make field E easier to see. Because this field is more than 100 feet from the creek, no spray drift buffer would be needed for a ground application. However, the field is within the 300-foot drift buffer distance for aerial applications. A spray drift buffer would be needed on the southwest corner of the field in the small area that is within the dark pink zone if the applicator chooses to apply this pesticide aerially. In this case, the 300-foot buffer requirement minus 250 feet of managed area between the field and the creek means that a 50-foot ecological spray drift buffer would be needed in that southwest corner for an aerial application. The buffer is not required on the entire south side of the field, only the portion that is within the required buffer distance of the creek. For all of the fields in this example with spray drift buffer requirements, field B, C, and E, drift mitigation measures could be used to reduce the size of the buffer. And for all of the fields I've talked about on this slide and the previous one, ecological spray drift buffers are required on the downwind side of the field, so these buffer zones might be in a different location on a day with a different wind direction. Now I'll go into several of the drift mitigation measures that can be used to reduce spray drift buffers. I'm not going to cover every mitigation measure for time's sake, but I'll highlight some new or revised mitigation measures. The spray drift mitigation measure for reduced application rates has not changed, but I'm including it here to highlight an important difference between runoff and erosion mitigation and spray drift mitigation. For runoff and erosion, the mitigation measure is based on annual application rates, because this reduces the total quantity of pesticide applied to the field in a growing season. In contrast, for spray drift buffers, the mitigation measure is based on reduced single application rates, because this reduces the quantity of pesticide that is released into the air at any one time. For pesticides that will only be applied once per season, this is functionally the same, but pesticide users will need to pay attention to this for pesticides that they plan to use multiple times in a year. Another difference between mitigation measures for runoff and erosion and spray drift is that some spray drift mitigation measures have different levels of effectiveness for different application methods, spray droplet sizes, and release heights. For this mitigation measure, the effectiveness of a rate reduction depends on the application method. For ground boom and aerial applications, the % reduction in the single application rate can be translated 1-for-1 into a reduction in the spray drift buffer distance. So a 50% single application rate reduction would reduce the buffer distance by 50%. For air blast applications, you would divide this reduction by 2. So a 50% single application rate reduction would reduce the drift buffer distance by 25%. Like with runoff and erosion rate reduction mitigation, users should consider resistance management and not apply less than the rate they expected is needed to achieve effective control of target pests. Reducing the treated area of the field is a spray drift mitigation measure that has been updated in response to public comment. For spray drift, this mitigation measure is not based directly on the % reduction in area treated, unlike for runoff and erosion mitigation. Instead, it is based on the number of passes that an applicator takes through the field. This is because the potential for drift increases with each time that application equipment drives through the field. The spray drift buffer reduction here depends on the application method. For ground boom applications, if the applicator makes one pass through the field or treats less than 1 acre, then a spray drift buffer can be reduced by 75%. Going down the table, as the applicator makes more passes across the field or as the pesticide application area gets larger, the % spray drift buffer reduction is less. And there are similar trends for aerial and air blast applications. Spray adjuvants are non-pesticide chemicals that can be included in pesticide formulations or added to tank mixes. There are many types of adjuvants used for different purposes, and some of them can reduce spray drift by reducing the amount of fine-sized spray droplets that are prone to drift. EPA has been evaluating wind tunnel data and ag drift modeling for adjuvants and determined that oil emulsion adjuvants can be used as drift mitigation measures for herbicides only with medium or coarser droplet sizes. For herbicides, when applying an oil emulsion adjuvant and a medium droplet size, a spray drift buffer can be reduced by 30%. For coarser droplets, spray drift buffers can be reduced by 15%. To qualify, the adjuvant has to be used at a rate of 0.3% volume per volume for ground applications, or 2.5% volume per volume for aerial applications. And for aerial applications with any droplet size, a minimum of 15 gallons per acre spray volume must be used. EPA is continuing to evaluate effectiveness of adjuvants for other pesticide types, application methods, and droplet-sized spray distributions. So there may be updates to this mitigation measure in the future, but for now, it is only for herbicides with oil emulsion adjuvants and the spray droplet sizes listed on this slide. Following the draft insecticide strategy, EPA received public comments about boom length reductions for aerial applications. EPA had previously included a 50% boom length reduction as a mitigation measure for aerial applications in wind speeds up to 10 miles per hour, and has now expanded this mitigation measure to include wind speeds up to 15 miles per hour. This allows additional flexibility for applicators in higher wind speeds. With a 50% reduction in boom length, the spray drift buffer can be reduced by 65% in wind speeds of 3 to 10 miles per hour, or by 50% in wind speeds of 10 to 15 miles per hour. The last mitigation measures I'll cover today are two new drift mitigation measures. These are both exclusively for air blast applications. The first is a targeted application rate reduction. This is somewhat similar to using targeted application technology for ground boom applications, where nozzles are turned on and off to target spray to foliage. And this results in a reduction in the overall application rate. In this case, targeted air blast application uses equipment that has either automated or manual human sensing to turn nozzles on and off to target orchard foliage and skip the areas in between trees. The amount of rate reduction achieved is going to depend on the foliage density of the orchard. The percent reduction in the spray drift buffer distance is equal to the percent application rate reduction. So a 50% rate reduction means the spray drift buffer distance can be reduced by 50%. The other mitigation measure on this slide is above canopy and above axial deflector nozzle management. If the air blast sprayer has nozzles higher than the canopy of the orchard, turn those nozzles off. Similarly, if the air blast equipment has axial deflectors, turn off any nozzles that are above those axial deflectors. If these nozzles are turned off, the spray drift buffer distance can be reduced by 10%. Today, we've gone over a brief overview of EPA strategies for reducing population-level impacts of pesticides to non-target species, including ESA-listed species, and highlighting where more information on these strategies can be found. For both runoff and erosion mitigation and spray drift mitigation, we went over how a pesticide user knows what mitigation is needed. We talked about where mitigation is needed and where it is not needed, and I presented updates and clarifications on several mitigation measures for both runoff and erosion and for spray drift. Runoff and erosion mitigation requirements are expressed as a number of points that have to be achieved with mitigation measures in order to use a pesticide. While drift mitigation requirements are expressed as a spray drift buffer distance, which can be modified with drift mitigation measures. For runoff, erosion, and spray drift, requirements will be listed on pesticide product labels and/or on the BLT website. And EPA has developed tools to help pesticide users in understanding EPA's strategies mitigation and to calculate mitigation for their individual fields. If you download a copy of these slides, you can use the hyperlinks in the presentation to access EPA's websites and strategies resources. And now we're going to switch over to Stephen Mula from the Environmental Fate and Effects Division to demo the mitigation menu website and the PALM tool that EPA has developed to assist pesticide users.
Hello, this demonstration is going to show you how to use EPA's Pesticide app for label mitigations, or PALM, and EPA's runoff erosion and spray drift XL calculators. I'm going to start with the mitigation menu website and the tools available there. On the main landing page, the top section is specific to runoff erosion mitigation, and the bottom section contains the spray drift information and reduction options. Before we move into these sections, I'll point out the helpful links in the box in the top right-hand corner of the web page. The link in this box takes you to the mitigation menu descriptions. There are also links to these descriptions in the options table. Let's start with runoff. The first section, titled How Do I Know if Runoff Erosion Mitigation is Required, provides step-by-step instructions for determining whether ecological runoff erosion mitigation measures are needed for a particular field or farm. If runoff erosion mitigation measures are needed, you can move on to the runoff erosion mitigation options section. In this section, there are links to the spray drift and runoff erosion calculator, which is a Microsoft Excel or spreadsheet, a user guide, and a worksheet version of the calculator that you can print out if you prefer. We also have a link to the Pesticide app for label mitigations, or PALM. Below these tools are tables 1 and 2, which list the mitigation relief options and the runoff erosion mitigation options, respectively. You can see that each option has links to the description for that option. Okay, let's get into our scenario. Looking again at our farm scenario slide, and specifically at field B, let's start with runoff erosion mitigation. When you first click on the Pesticide app for label mitigations, you will see a landing page with general information and buttons for either the runoff/erosion calculator or the ecological spray drift calculator. We will click on the runoff/erosion calculator button. That takes us to another landing page with a button that says Get Started. Click on that button and you will see an optional field that allows you to give a name to the field or management unit. This could be helpful if you plan to use the app to calculate points for multiple fields or management areas. So let's call this field something simple, like the letter B, and click Next. I'll also point out the product information and crop use site fields are to help the user keep track of their specific details. They do not change any of the options available in the app, and they are optional fields. In step 2, you're asked a series of questions if any of these apply to your field. Then you do not need to proceed with the calculations. Simply click on the measures that apply to your field. Notice that if I click on yes, there is an irrigation tailwater return system in place, you're given the opportunity to skip to the final summary, as no further runoff erosion mitigation is needed. You'll also see that there are links to the descriptions for each of these measures. For managed areas, the definition is included directly on the page. For the purposes of this demo, we'll click None of the Above and then Next. When we get to step 3, you'll need to select how many points you need for the field. To determine this, you'll have to check the label as well as any bulletins for the product or products you intend to use. For the demo, we'll choose the maximum number of points, 9, and then click Next. Keep in mind, you may not need 9 points. This is just for demonstration purposes. You can see that the banner at the top tracks your current number of mitigation points, at this stage 0, and the number of points that need to be achieved, 9 points based on our example here. In step 4, you can select options for systems that capture runoff and discharge. You'll notice on the top left that if you select one of these options, the current points earned for your field will increase. For example, a water retention pond provides 2 points. However, for this demo, we'll select Not Applicable and then click Next. In step 5, we can check for mitigation relief based on pesticide runoff vulnerability. To do so, you need to select a state and county. For example, if we select Georgia and Appling County, we get 2 points. For field B, we'll select Arkansas and Mississippi County. There are no relief points for this county, so we will still need to obtain 9 points. Moving on to step 6, we look at a few other options that will provide points. For this field, we will select Yes for mitigation tracking, since we will have that option at the end to save and print a summary of our calculations here. We already have our first point. Notice the other 2 options. You can get 1 point by working with a technical specialist, or 2 points by participating in a non-qualified runoff/erosion conservation program. So if you get to the end of this process and you do not get to the number of points needed for your field, these are 2 options you may want to consider. In step 7, we will start to look at field characteristics. Since we have a flat field, we will select Yes for field slope with less than or equal to 3%. This field also has moderately sandy soils, so we will select that option. We will get 2 points for the flat field and another 2 points for moderately sandy soils, so we are now up to 5 points in total for our example, field B. In step 8, we can select options for in-field mitigation measures. Under conservation tillage, we will select reduce tillage for an additional 2 points. Again, there are links to the descriptions for these different mitigation measures. Scrolling down, we'll look at irrigation management. We are not irrigating this field, so we will select dry farming, non-irrigated fields, no irrigation. We receive 3 more points for this method of irrigation management, and so we are now at 10 points, which is higher than the 9 points we needed for this demonstration. However, let's click through the next steps. In step 9, you can select field-adjacent mitigation measures, such as grassed waterways and vegetated filter strips. For our field, we are going to select a 20-foot riparian forest buffer, which gives us an additional point. However, you'll see that 2 points were added to the total. I'll explain this in the next step. Step 10 is for other mitigation measures. Based on our previous selections, we received a yes for using mitigation measures from multiple categories because we selected both in-field and field-adjacent mitigation measures. Since we received an additional point for using multiple categories, in step 9, the additional point was automatically added. On to step 11. For step 11, we have the option to include application-specific parameters that could help us receive additional points. For example, if we're able to use a reduced application rate or soil incorporate the product, we can add those, which would help us receive the necessary points if other mitigation options were not feasible. However, since we have more than 9 points for this field, we'll just select Next. Step 12 shows us the resulting mitigation points and a summary of what we selected. As you can see, we ended up with 12 points and confirmation that we met the runoff erosion mitigation requirements needed for our demonstration. We can also see the options we selected that led to those points. If we didn't meet the requirements, we could click a link to see the list of the remaining mitigation options to see what else we may be able to do. We also have the option to print this page if we want to save it for our records. From here, you can either print it or save it as a PDF. Note that the tool does not save or submit your information to the EPA. So that concludes the runoff portion of the PALM demonstration. If you also need to figure out spray drift, you can click on the link on the bottom right to begin calculating spray drift buffer reductions. Let's do that. The purpose of this demo is to walk through the EPA's ecological spray drift reduction calculator in PALM. Like the runoff erosion mitigation calculator, we start off on a page with general information. However, unlike the runoff erosion mitigation calculator, we'll have to consider specific application information from the beginning. Let's click Get Started. For step 1, we need to determine if ecological spray drift buffers apply. If the label or bulletin references the Mitigation menu website when describing ecological spray drift buffers, we will click Yes. As with the runoff erosion calculator, we have the option to identify the field or management unit. So far for step 2, we're going to continue talking about field B, so we'll enter B. You also have the option to add product and/or use site information. In step 3, we need to select the type of application. Let's start out with ground boom. In step 4, we can consider whether any of our application conditions would require an ecological spray drift buffer. Since there are non-managed areas downwind of the field and none of the other conditions apply, we'll select No for both of these questions, then click Next. We need to enter some product label information in step 5. First, we need to look at the label in any bulletins and enter the buffer distance. We're going to put in 100 feet. Next, we have to select the minimum spray droplet size indicated on the product label. We're going to select medium, which is also the default if it's not specified on the label. For boom height, we're going to select consider this later and then click next. In step 6, we're going to go through different options that can reduce the ecological spray drift buffer. We're going to enter 1 pound per acre for both the labeled and planned application rate. Since we're going to apply at the labeled rate, there's no reduction in the spray drift buffer. We are also going to assume that we are treating 5 acres, so we will select width of treated area larger than 200 feet up to 400 feet, or area treated larger than 4 acres and up to 10 acres. If we scroll to the top, we can see that treating an area of this size reduced our buffer by 15% or 15 feet. Continuing on, this field is in a humid area and the day we plan to apply will be humid, so we're going to skip down to the bottom and select yes, for relative humidity is 60% or more at the time of application. That reduced the buffer by another 10% or 10 feet, and our current buffer is now 75 feet. Let's consider what else we can do to reduce the buffer. For example, spraying below the crop using drop nozzles would reduce our buffer by 50%. So now with these 3 options selected, our buffer has been reduced to 25 feet. We can also consider things like increased droplet size, using a drift reduction agent if applying an herbicide, or other options. Also keep in mind that for the ecological spray drift buffer, unless otherwise specified on the label, we only have to buffer on the downwind side of the field and do not have to buffer from other managed areas, such as field C and F. We can also consider windbreaks or other similar options for future applications. For example, if we add a basic windbreak, we would no longer need an ecological spray drift buffer. For now, I'm going to put not applicable for the windbreak and move on to the next step. We're on step 7, the summary page. Considering the buffer reduction options we selected, we now have a buffer of 25 feet, and we can also see the options we selected and how much they reduced our buffer. Again, we have the option to print and save this information for our files. For our next example, we're going to take another look at the same field but select aerial application this time. We'll use the Start Over button to clear our inputs and start over at the beginning. Let's quickly run through our same selections for steps 1 and 2. We select aerial for step 3 and no for both options in step 4. This time, since we're applying aerially, we see that the label requires a 300 feet buffer, so we'll enter that in step 5. We're going to enter a fine droplet size for both the labeled and planned droplet size. In step 6, we are going to keep the same maximum label and planned application rate as well, 1 pound per acre. And then take a look at our reduction options. Let's assume again that we're applying to 5 acres. Let's select the option that says 2 to 4 flight passes or 1.5 to less than 6 acres. This reduced our buffer by 20% to 240 acres, or feet rather. Let's continue to boom length. We could select standard boom length, but we'd like to reduce our buffer. The wind is between 10 and 15 miles per hour, so we're going to select reduced boom length 50% and wind speed 10 to 15 miles per hour at time of application. This reduces our buffer by 50%, so we've already reduced our buffer to 90 feet. Finally, the area is still humid, so we can select yes for the relative humidity option. Click Next, and now we're on the summary page. Our adjusted aerial spray drift buffer is 60 feet, and again we can see the options we selected, and we have the option to print or save the information as a PDF. As a reminder, none of the information entered here will be collected by the government. All right, so that concludes our Palm demo, and now Frank Ferrugia is going to give a demo on the runoff erosion and spray drift Excel calculators.
Hello. Another tool available to you is a Microsoft Excel calculator. It does the same thing as the app, but if you want, you can download the Excel file to your computer for your files. In the interest of time, we're not going to run through the full scenario we just did using the app, but I do want to point out a few features and differences. Let's open the calculator and walk through part of the runoff and erosion scenario. To get the calculator, you click on Spray Drift and Runoff Calculators anywhere on our mitigation website, save it to your local drive, and open the file. The first time you open the file, you may need to click Enable Content. The first tab has helpful descriptive information about the workbook. The second tab is our runoff calculator, and the third tab is our spray drift calculator. Clicking on the Runoff and Erosion tab, you'll first see some instructions and a section where you can include optional information. There are also two buttons to the right. One, which clears out all of what you've entered in this worksheet, and the other, which allows you to create a duplicate of this worksheet for another field. Okay, let's get into our scenario. We'll go back to our farm scenario and again, take a look at field B next to the river. First question is there mitigation relief if the area at least 1,000 feet down gradient from the treated field only contains managed areas? Notice that here and throughout the calculator, there are brief descriptions of the options being discussed. There are also hyperlinks that take you to the full description of the mitigation menu page. Just click hyperlink and it will take you there. Looking at our field, it's not 1,000 feet from the river, so we'll select no from the dropdown. For the purposes of this demo, we will also select no for systems that capture runoff and discharge. Now we can select our state and county to determine if the field receives any geographic relief points. By selecting Arkansas first and Mississippi County second. And we can see that this county is not eligible for credit. Continuing on, we can select yes for mitigation tracking. If we plan to keep a copy of this calculation, we receive 1 point as we did before with the app. Rather than go through all of the options we did with the app, I'll skip field characteristics and we'll just select one option from the infield options and one option from the field adjacent options. For infield options, let's select reduce tillage. For field adjacent measures, I'm going to select 20 to 30 foot option for riparian forest buffer, riparian herbaceous cover. If we scroll down, we can see that the mitigation point for using multiple categories was automatically selected, just as it was in the app. Since we didn't go through all of the options again, we can see the green highlighted cells that we ended up with 5 points based on the field. Below this, we could still go through the application parameters to see if we can adjust anything for the application to receive additional points. Just for demonstration purposes, I will select yes for soil incorporation. We can see that we get an additional point for that. Now we can look at the blue highlighted cells at the bottom of the spreadsheet. This is where we can see the total mitigation points, which is 6. If we had selected all of the same options as we did in the app example, we would have ended up with 12 points again. As you can see, the calculator app and worksheet allow you to do the same things, but depending on your preferences and situation, one of these options may work best for you. For now, EPA intends to keep all 3 options available for use. All of these tools can save the calculated information if you want to earn mitigation tracking point, but saving is optional. EPA won't be storing any of the information entered in either the calculator or the app. Thank you for following along with the demo. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Libby, Stephen, and Frank for your informative presentations. Now is the time to post your questions using the chat space on the right of your screen, indicated by the red arrow. As a reminder, you can download today's presentation by pressing the paper icon highlighted with the green arrow. And we've already started to receive some questions, so I will go for it. I'll ask the first one. Will this webinar be recorded? Can I get a copy of the slides and a recording of the presentation? Yes, this webinar has been recorded. To download a PDF version of this presentation, you can click that paper icon. But we'll also be posting these slides as well as the recording of this presentation to EPA's Pesticide and Endangered Species Educational Resources Toolbox at a later date. You can use that downloaded slide that you download from the paper icon to you get access to the links to go directly to that website. If you don't have access to that for some reason, you can also go to www.epa.gov/endangered-species and look under the resources section of that website to get to that toolbox. For our second question, where do I access previous webinars and ESA information? What outreach and training materials are available to learn more about the strategies? So again, you can go to that Pesticides and Endangered Species Educational Resources Toolbox to get direct links to the strategies, as well as our previous webinars. We also have additional information there. As previously mentioned in this webinar, there's a link to the previous webinar in 2023 on Bulletins Live 2. We have additional resources for Bulletins Live 2 there, including a handout that can be shared with pesticide applicators for basic information about using Bulletins Live 2, a frequently asked questions, and a quick start guide, among other things. We also have links to the spray drift and runoff and erosion worksheets that do the same thing as both the Excel calculator and the Palm app that we've talked about today. They're just a printable copy that you can take out into the field. So lots of things there that you can access. For our next question, several attendees have asked about offline access and lack of internet access in agricultural areas. What can people use if they don't have access to the internet? As I mentioned just a second ago, we have worksheets that are PDFs that people can download to calculate both runoff and erosion points or spray drift points. And these are available online. If you do not have access to Wi-Fi, you may need to go somewhere else to get a copy, or it may be handed out during training programs if you want to use that instead. Let's see, the next question is for Frank. How did EPA determine how many points each mitigation or mitigation relief option is worth? For example, participating in a conservation program is worth 2 points, whereas reservoir tillage is worth 3 points.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we used multiple lines of evidence. It was a science-based decision, and which incorporated factual information about each individual mitigation measure, weighed any empirical data, so actual scientific studies, as well as a comparative across different kinds of mitigation measures and the information we have from modeling. The whole methodology and the description of the source information is provided in the ecological mitigation support document, version 2, which is found in the toolbox that Nicole had just referenced as well.
Thank you, Frank. Our next question is for Libby. What does co-application mean in the slide reduction in annual application rate?
Yeah, so this was on the slide for the runoff and erosion mitigation measure, reduction in annual application rates, but I didn't really talk about it. So this is a good question. Co-application is a way that for some pesticides, pesticide users could reduce their annual application rate. So this is co-applying an active ingredient with a different active ingredient, usually with tank mixing. And for, if you're picking a compatible pesticide with that, you may be able to use a lower application rate and still achieve effective control of your target pests. So that's one way that you can reduce your application rate without losing efficacy of your pesticide.
Thank you. Our next question is for Frank. Is the point system and mitigation menu required only when there is population level impacts to listed species identified, or is this also used when EPA identifies risks to non-listed species?
Yeah, that's a great question. The origins of the point system and the buffer, the methodology of mitigation stems from ESA initiatives to reduce the chance of, or the likelihood of population level impacts. However, they are useful for describing mitigations that may be needed for non-listed species or habitat protection as well. And in some cases, EPA may determine that that would be the best way to communicate levels of mitigation needed to protect non-listed taxa. It's not going to be universal, but it'll be a case-by-case basis for how we address that.
Thank you. Our next question is also for Frank. How are the drift mitigation buffers calculated? Do you have resources such as publications or calculations to better understand the approach?
Yeah, so we use a tool called AgDrift when necessary. The AgDrift model was developed by USDA and has been used by EPA for many years now. We are updating portions of that model based on empirical data that are submitted to the agency. We recently did an update of our interpretation of spray drift for aerial applications to revise the curves. And we're currently working on revising or exploring the revision of ground spray depositions. So in the strategies, what happens with spray drift in order to identify a buffer, what kind of buffer is necessary for application, we first look at the endpoints that are used, so the toxicological endpoint used for the population level impact, and compare that to the application rate. The application rate divided by the endpoint provides us with an understanding of how much potential impact could there be. And based upon that, we have a low, medium, or high, and the low results in one set of buffers. The high results in our maximum buffers, and the medium requires us to take a look at that AgDrift model and see how far out we may have that population level impact, and those are how we determine those various buffers. More description about that process is provided in the insecticide strategy. It came out after the final herbicide strategy and describes that process as it was updated from public comments that came in on the insecticide strategy, and it's directly applicable to the herbicide strategy as well. So, thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And this, I'm going to open this next question up to anyone. Can spray drift buffer mitigation be applied in PULA areas to reduce the spray buffer distance needed?
I'll be happy to answer that one. So yeah, spray drift buffers may be applicable only within PULAs, or they may be on the whole label, meaning that a use used anywhere nationally may have a spray drift buffer. They could differ, meaning that outside of PULAs, outside of where a species is, a vulnerable species is expected to occur, may have, say, a 10-foot buffer on there to protect general list endangered species or non-listed taxa. And then within the PULAs, they may have something larger, like a maximum buffer for one of the droplet sizes. So we can use the PULAs as a geographic description of, okay, in this area you need a little bit more than everywhere else, and so that way we can tailor the mitigation to where it's needed most.
Thank you, Frank. My next few questions I think are for Stephen. So the first one is, who should I contact if I have a problem with Palm or find any errors?
Yeah, great question. We have an email inbox that you can send any of your questions or concerns to. It is palm@epa.gov. So that's PALM@epa.gov. Yeah, we welcome any feedback or any questions folks might have.
Thank you. And the next one is, what is included on the printed sheet when I complete the app for the mitigation tracking point?
Yeah, so that summary page is what's going to be printed out, that very final kind of tab that I showed in the runoff/erosion calculator or mitigation calculator in Palm. And it has all the options that you've selected to get to the point value that you have. So not only does it have the points you needed based on your label or bulletins, which you input yourself, it also has the points you've achieved and the list of all the different mitigation options you've selected.
I wanted to add a little bit more to that too. The Excel workbook, the Excel-based calculator, the runoff and spray drift calculator web sheets are printable. So they print off as a single block of paper, so that you can keep those in paper form for your records as well. So.
Thank you. This question is either for Libby or Stephen. The introductory portion indicated that managed areas could be subtracted from the required ecological spray drift buffer to reduce some of the buffer distance. Where is that option in the Palm calculator?
Yeah, so that's not an explicit option in the Palm calculator right now. I think that's something you do when you're actually putting in the distance that you need. So in the example I used, 300 feet or 100 feet. If you knew that you had that downwind, that managed area that you could subtract from it, you would do it there and make sure you're only putting in, that area subtracted out.
Yeah, I'll add to this too. If someone has, say, 150 feet of areas that are managed, and then their label says you need to have 300, like in the example that Stephen went through. You go through your mitigation measures and you can tailor your application down to that 150 feet, right? So as long as you get it down to the area that's all managed, you don't have to do an infield buffer. If it's anything larger, if that, say you were able to tailor your application down and get it down to not 150 feet, but 170 feet, then you'd have to consider any additional changes or put an infield buffer of 20 feet to deal with that. And that's how that works. And both the Excel calculator and the app function in that way, to where you can tailor it down to what you need to do. Your fields are known by you, and the wind direction for that may be favorable for different application situations, and where one side you have a large managed area and the other side you don't. And so this allows you to kind of gauge out different mitigations that may be needed for different situations, and get credit for that, the presence of those landscapes being there and those mitigations that you're addressing through the application. As you can imagine, it's impossible for us to do that from here in Washington, D.C. For when we do assessments on the nation. So.
Thank you, Stephen and Frank. I'm just going to do a quick time check. We have about 6 minutes left. So we're going to get to as many questions as we can. We do have a copy of all of the questions that have been submitted, so we appreciate it. And we will be looking at all of them. I'm going to move on to the next question now. It's for Frank. Is EPA going to continue to maintain the Excel worksheet version of the calculator?
Yeah, for the time being, we found that stakeholders have been interested in keeping the Excel-based calculators, so we're going to keep them in lockstep. So any changes that are needed on the Excel calculator to fix errors, or if there are identified additional mitigations over time, we'll apply those to the Excel-based calculator. We'll apply those to the app, and we'll update the printable worksheets as well to keep them all in synchrony so they can be used. And we imagine stakeholders are going to be using these in different ways. That we want to maintain that, and we'll reassess this over time. If the app, as the app develops, it's going to have more functionality that the Excel-based tool and the worksheet aren't going to be able to accommodate. So we'll have to reassess later.
Thank you. This question is for Stephen. What is the future of the app?
Yeah, great question. So the EPA is intending to continue to expand the functionality of the app of Palm, and hopefully that will include access to additional information like labeling and bulletins. It's still relatively new, so that's still in development.
Thank you. This question is for Frank or Libby. I'd like to practice with these tools before I present to our growers. Can you suggest a few products that have labels that would be good practice?
I can take this one. So we do have a couple of products out already that do have runoff and erosion mitigation and spray drift mitigation on the labels already. The first one that went out was L-glufosinate. The product name is Liberty Ultra. So if you'd like to look at a label that already has this mitigation on there, go look up that label and you can practice before you're ready to see it on a lot of other labels in the future.
Thank you, Libby. I'll take the next question. It is, where can I find the spreadsheet? So I'm assuming you're referring to the Excel worksheet that Frank was demonstrating. That can be found both on the mitigation menu website and on the pesticide and endangered species educational resources toolbox, both of which the links are in the PDF of the slides that are available on that paper icon. The next question is, I think we may have already sort of alluded to this, but will the app include Bulletins Live 2 in the future?
Yeah, we're looking at how to expand that functionality for sure.
All right, thank you. We have about 2 minutes, so I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. This one is for anyone. What is the typical time frame between EPA's registration review, risk mitigation, or label change implementation based on its own biological evaluation versus additional risk mitigation and label changes resulting from a Fish and Wildlife Service or NIMP SPI-UP?
I think we're going to have to come back to that question at a later time.
Okay.
Maybe we'll add this one to our FAQs
Okay.
or respond to the person individually. So.
Thank you. And the next question is for Frank. How did the spray drift buffers change between the final herbicide strategy and final insecticide strategy?
That's a great question. So we received a lot of different comments over the course of the strategy development, and in the development of the final insecticide strategy, we revisited the spray drift buffer, max buffer concept, and the processes of which went into it, and the information that we considered. So these additional lines of evidence stem from scientific literature, from different modeling, and further characterization of exposure and population level data that we had made available through that public process, that public comment process. Those lines of evidence and that methodology are described in the mitigation support document version 2, which I said was on the tools website that Nicole was referencing. And what you'll see in there is that there were some relatively large changes that happened in max buffer distances for several different droplet and application processes. And in the mitigation support document, it steps through the information and how we got that. And we also simplified some of the places where the buffers were, how the buffers were calculated in terms of their similar outcomes, like ground spray, coarse and medium droplets. Coarse, medium droplets don't have differences in their boom height right now in terms of buffer distances. As I mentioned, we have additional data that we're considering, and more data is to be submitted from stakeholders on ground sprays, and we may revisit some of this over time. And but for now, you'll see all the evidence and the description of that in our mitigation support document.
Thank you, Frank. And with that, we are out of time. I thank you all for attending today's webinar. Like we said earlier, we will be posting this recording and the slides to our website at a later date. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks.